So another thing that I wanted to talk about with the pulmonary system is cystic fibrosis. If we're discussing cystic fibrosis, the cystic part about this is that we're causing cysts, perpetual issues with the lungs, and it's fibrotic in that we end up getting a lot of scarring in the lungs. The problem with cystic fibrosis can really be boiled down to something called the CFTR gene. The CFTR gene is, under normal circumstances, the way that we actually get in a membrane or a protein inserted in the membrane. So when we found out that people that had cystic fibrosis had this problem, right, they have a mutant version of this gene, a broken version of this gene. So we named it the cystic fibrosis, right? So having this gene does not cause cystic fibrosis. Having a broken version of this gene causes cystic fibrosis. The last two parts of this tell you what it actually does, right? It's a transmembrane conductance, so getting something into the plasma membrane. Remember that plasma membrane is that lipid bilayer where we have the little tiny balls and then the little tiny wiggly lipid bits on the end of it, right? These phospholipids, right? When we're talking about transmembrane, we're trying to insert something. Gosh, I wish it would stop doing that. We're trying to insert something that actually crosses both of these. Think of like channels are transmembrane proteins. And the regulator is the thing that's helping this process along, right? So the reason why CFTR is pretty commonly seen is we actually think that CFTR individuals with this sort of mutation actually was slightly protective against the Black Death, right? The big bubonic plague that killed a third of Europe. So if you were somebody with this, it was actually a positive selection to having cystic fibrosis because it protected you a little bit from this, which is why this tends to show up more commonly in European background individuals. Cystic fibrosis, remember, is an autosomal recessive condition. Remember what autosomal means is it's going to show up on the first 22 chromosomes, chromosome 1 through chromosome 22, the chromosome pair 23 being those X and Y chromosomes. So this is going to show up somewhere in that chromosome 1 through 22, right? The ones that males have, females have, everybody has the same amount under normal circumstances. So if it's an autosomal recessive condition, that also means that you have to have two strikes against you to actually have the disorder. You have to have both one from your mom and one from your father that you've inherited, which means, hey, if this doesn't have anything to do with X and Y, males and females are equally likely to have cystic fibrosis. It has no relationship with sex. This is what cystic fibrosis, the cystic fibrosis transmembrane conductor regulator gene is supposed to do, right? It's supposed to help insert this thing that's a chlorine pump. When this chlorine pump is present, you're able to actually push chlorine from inside the cell towards outside the cell, right? This is something that you actively might be pumping it against its concentration gradient, so it takes energy to do, but this is allowing chlorine to be excreted outside of cells. Well, why on earth would you care whether or not chlorine is inside or outside of the cell, right? Why do you care about this gradient? You don't necessarily care about chlorine, but as you pump more and more chlorine out of these cells, well, what's going to follow that chlorine is you're going to have water following its concentration gradient. I'm making the area outside of the cell saltier. Where does water want to be? Water wants to be in a salty area to try and balance out the concentration gradients. Well, now that more water that then follows along ends up thinning any kind of secretion that's outside of the cell. Any kind of goo that's surrounding the cell gets a little bit thinner because you're pumping salt water into it, basically. This explains a lot of the reasons why we have the different effects that we see with transmembrane conductance. Individuals with this broken version of the CFTR gene have a pretty characteristic problem. And it's going to be present in all cells around the body. So when we're talking about transmembrane conductance, remember, right, we have that lipid bilayer. that lipid bilayer is supposed to be allowing this transmembrane protein to be inserted. So we have this CFTR chlorine pump that is allowing chlorine molecules to move outside the cell. Well, if I have chlorine able to be excreted in higher concentrations, the water is then going to follow that concentration gradient. Oh, I shouldn't use blue. Now I'm going to have to make water red like a weirdo. Water is going to follow that concentration gradient, right? The more water that is showing up outside the cell, the thinner this whatever secretions that we're talking about that are outside the cell become, right? More water kind of thins this goo. Well, what's going wrong with this in individuals with a CFTR gene error? Well, it's not that they don't make this chlorine pump. It's that this chlorine pump is not properly inserted. So you still end up having individuals with cystic fibrosis still have this chlorine pump, right? They're still going to have the ability to pump chlorine, but there's really nowhere that it goes. It just goes from inside the cell to also inside the cell, right? The failure has to do with the fact that we're not inserting this in the plasma membrane, so we don't end up having it actually do its job effectively. Just as a further explanation of like how important genes are, most individuals with cystic fibrosis have a error at the 508th amino acid site. So this cystic fibrosis transmembrane conductance regulator gene has all of this genetic material. They have 1,480 amino acids. Right? So this is a really long protein. A very, very, very minor problem. A condition called delta F508. So delta as in a change. So and the change being a deletion in this case, D for deletion, D for delta. So you have a deletion of the F amino acid. And there's not actually an amino acid called F, it's phenylalanine. There's already another thing called P, so that's why they made another one that said like F. So at the 508th spot, you just delete one single amino acid. That is the entirety of the change between somebody with cystic fibrosis and somebody that doesn't have cystic fibrosis. Most individuals with cystic fibrosis have this delta F508 version of cystic fibrosis. So this is a pretty common thing, right? This one minor deletion means that the chlorine pump that you're producing is not able to insert into this cell. Well, what effects does this have is really going to be entirely dependent on the portion of the body that you're looking at. If you're somebody that has this, if you're a homozygote, remember this is an autosomal recessive condition, so you have to have two broken copies, you end up making thick secretions. You're going to see this first at birth in the meconium, but you're also going to see this in pretty much anywhere else that's excreting things out of the body. So you see it in the pancreas and you see it in the lungs pretty substantially. So what are we talking about with meconium? Meconium is the first bowel movement after birth, right? So this is all the stuff that you've been consuming and kind of processing out waste product while you're still in utero, right? So this is not food that you've actually ingested. This is all stuff that's come through the umbilical cord. So the meconium is the first, it's generally very tar, even in normal patients, it's generally kind of like tar-like and is very gooey and sticky. It's kind of a, when this comes, it doesn't look like any other poop that you're ever going to have in your life, right? So when the meconium is being produced, right, this secretion ends up actually causing a blockage because this secretion is too thick and is too sticky. So in patients that are just born, we really, really, really want them to pass a bowel movement, right? We want them to poop because that's a sign that they don't have cystic fibrosis. So if you have this blockage occurring, well, that becomes a big problem awfully quick because now any other fecal material that's coming down the line is not going to be able to move into that, and you're going to start having distension behind wherever that blockage is occurring. In this case, it's the small intestine. That's a normal site, but you could have a distension wherever that meconium gets blocked up. So that's at birth. We don't normally see this in other areas. In the intestines, most of the intestinal secretions are not going to cause a lot of the problems. In adult patients, cystic fibrosis causes problems with the mucociliary escalator. If it's been a bit since you heard the mucociliary escalator, remember, if I inhale some dust, I inhale some bacteria, right, whatever, it gets stuck in this goo, this mucus that's lining my trachea and my bronchi, right? The goo then gets paddled up, right, through the actions of these cilia lining this vessel. So these cilia are actually pushing out all of this excess gunk, and when you kind of have like too much stuff in the back of your throat and you swallow, what you're actually swallowing is you're producing and pushing up stuff out of your airways and swallowing it back down into the esophagus. Individuals with cystic fibrosis, right? Remember, the problem is the mucus is too thick, so you actually end up not being able to beat and push this mucus. So the mucociliary escalator is really just a mucociliary fly trap, and it's not able to actually push this mucus up and out to eventually be digested into the stomach for destruction. But cystic fibrosis patients are going to have this bacteria stick to the walls and not really go anywhere. So if this bacteria sticks and stays in some place and it's kind of static, well, now it can start worming its way into the lung tissue itself, and it starts attacking and destroying the lungs. So cystic fibrosis exacerbations are just a bacterial infection, right? This means that individuals with cystic fibrosis are pretty much perpetually going to be fighting off some level of lung pathogen. If you are a individual with cystic fibrosis, you're taking antibiotics all the time to deal with these bacterial infections. Taking antibiotics all the time is a pretty high risk for selecting for those bacteria that are able to survive it. So, unsurprisingly, they end up having a lot of antibiotic-resistant infections. Additionally, this chronic inflammation from perpetually having inflamed lungs is going to lead to a lot of fibrosis, right? A lot of damage showing up and scar tissue showing up, which causes a reduction in pliability of the lungs themselves, right? We've made a lot of gains in cystic fibrosis, right? As we've started to help individuals with cystic fibrosis, we've increased the life expectancy pretty substantially in the last few years, right? It's now somewhere around 50 so years for most cystic fibrosis patients. The problem comes from as the heart has to work harder to deal with these lung problems, the cystic fibrosis patients are eventually going to die because of a heart attack problem. The heart is under increased stress because of congestive heart failure. That is the point of failure. This isn't the only place that we have secretions in the body. It's one of the more important ones. Pancreatic duct secretions are also important for things like diabetes. If you end up having the pancreatic duct get inflamed and then blocked up, well, all of that acinar cell secretions, the ones that are pancreatic enzymes that break things down, they end up breaking down and destroying the pancreas. Well, if they destroy the pancreas, well, now you've basically given yourself diabetes. Additionally, all of the secretions that are associated with reproduction, if you can't have sperm swim through this or have eggs move freely through your secretions, well, now you're going to be infertile. So most patients with cystic fibrosis can't actually have kids. How do you treat this? How do you deal with the problems? Mostly these mucus plugs that are building up in the lungs, if you are using these physiotherapy vests called the oscillation vests that are actually hitting you with puffs of air, and I'm not sure if this is going to pick up on mic, but if you probably not. If you're perpetually hitting the chest, it's almost like you're coughing or slapping on someone's back, and you're breaking up these mucus plugs. allowing a little bit more of it to start moving upwards. A lot of medications that we're going to talk about are useful in helping to deal with this cystic fibrosis transmembrane conductance problem. But the last step for most cystic fibrosis patients is get a new pair of lungs. And somebody always asks a question like, well, don't those lungs start degrading as well? And no, they don't. Well, because if you have lungs from somebody that doesn't have cystic fibrosis, those cells don't have this sort of error, or at least they don't have both of their genes be this errored version of this. So this new lung tissue has the genome of the person that you took it from, right? So this lung is not going to start to fail just like these original patient's lungs. The two medications that I want to talk about specifically to deal with cystic fibrosis are ivacaftor and lumacaftor. Ivacaftor is going to help out because this chlorine channel that is being inserted inside the surface of these cells to start secreting more chlorine, well, if you get a little bit of this channel inserted, well, ivacaftor makes this a really, really efficient one, right? So it ends up holding this channel open. So whatever CFTR protein you're actually able to make its way into the surface, just by pure luck almost, that ends up being secreting a ton of chlorine. The flip side of this is lumacaftor. Lumacaftor is actually going to act as almost like a chaperone or a shepherd, and it's going to help enable more of this chlorine channel to be inserted into the surface. So it's kind of acting like what is supposed to be the function of this CFTR gene, this broken region that's supposed to enable the insertion of this. Lumacaftor is kind of picking up where that mutation has caused a failure point. Generally, you're going to take both of these sorts of medications if you have cystic fibrosis. This is not a cheap thing. What you're seeing right there is a month and a half supply of ivacaftor. This cost, the one box that you're seeing is $24,000, right? So that's a little over half my salary to hold in one hand, right? So that's a big deal. When we're talking about someone with cystic fibrosis, the costs are you either pay for this or your lungs stop up, your lungs fill with antibiotic-resistant infections of bacteria, right? So this is a pretty motivating thing for people with cystic fibrosis to spend this money. A question that I have that normally is going to be something that I would try and do in a Socrative, but I've kind of switched a little bit. If you have cystic fibrosis, why would you be told to not have a high-fat diet, right? Why would you be told to try and focus more on carbs and focus more on the non-lipid versions of your diet? Well, if we stop and think about that, what is fat? Fat is just these lipids that are being broken down by lipases. Our major source for lipases is the pancreas itself, right? So if we're constantly secreting a bunch of stuff out of the pancreas, that leads to problems because now the pancreas is potentially more likely to become blocked up and inflamed. Right? So this is why if you have cystic fibrosis, they tell you not to go to McDonald's and kind of get really oily fries and an oily burger. That's a big problem. It's a big risk factor for you. The last disease that I think I'm going to talk about, this is the last one, is Mycobacterium tuberculosis, the thing that causes tuberculosis infections. TB is a really nasty bug because it is really, really resistant to environmental conditions. It has this thick, waxy coating that's going to enable it to deal with stuff like heat, ultraviolet rays coming from the sun, acidic and basic conditions in a puddle of water, right? So TB is really, really hardy, and it's difficult for us to kill it even if it's outside of the body. The problem with TB comes from the fact that it actually preferentially is okay with being inside of a macrophage. So if I ingest a little bit of tuberculosis droplets that have tuberculosis bacterium inside of them, The thing that's supposed to sweep this up is my alveolar macrophages, these really aggressive macrophages that are supposed to clear foreign material from my lungs. The problem is the kind of the virus that you're seeing right here is going to get broken down and destroyed, right? Remember, we have a phagosome. That phagosome is bound with a lysosome, and then we have the broken bits and chunks in a phagolysosome. Well, what TB is doing is TB actually is okay with getting eaten by a macrophage. It's not the best thing in the world, but it's not the end of the world. But what TB does is TB actually blocks this process by which we kind of meld a lysosome filled with these kind of caustic digestive enzymes. We can't ever bind those with that phagosome. So we end up, the macrophage ends up eating the tuberculosis, and it just kind of sits there, right? Just kind of hangs out. We can't ever destroy that macrophage. We can't ever destroy that tuberculosis. That's why eventually we'll fill that macrophage, and then the macrophage will rupture with a bunch of live tuberculosis bacterium. We end up having a pretty common arrangement in infections and tuberculosis. No matter what your end state is going to be, you generally have a primary tuberculosis infection where you have a big burst of tuberculosis breeding inside the body. You have a lot of lung degradation and functional loss. But most individuals are going to kind of beat this initial wave by walling off the tuberculosis with this kind of cheese-like structure called caseum, right? Remember, caseous necrosis is this kind of cheese-like material that you'll see in pretty much just tuberculosis patients. This is, hey, we're having a really hard time beating tuberculosis. Let's just lock this tuberculosis in jail, right? Let's just prevent it from leaving this little nodule that it's located in. This is basically us giving up and saying, all right, we can't kill this thing, or we're having a hard time killing tuberculosis. If we restrain it and stop it from moving out of this area, then it's still going to be under control, though. At this point, this is why we see things called Gone complexes. Gone complexes are these kind of caseous nodules that, if you just slice them open, are kind of gooey and cheese filled, right? Kind of almost like a hard cheese, not like nacho cheese or anything. Hope nobody's eating while you're watching this. At this point, you've kind of beat tuberculosis. You've managed to prevent tuberculosis from spreading rapidly, but because remember, tuberculosis has that waxy coating that's really resistant to damage and destruction, well, now we're more likely to have something called a latent infection. Tuberculosis is not, you haven't completely wiped it out, you've stopped it from spreading, but it's almost like a truce at this point, where we can't quite kill it and it can't get out of the cell, so it's trapped inside these Gone complexes. Eventually, though, these Gone complexes, especially if we're talking about individuals that have immunodeficiencies, right? If your immune system is not keeping up and keep kind of controlling tabs on these tuberculosis infection, these Gone complexes can start to break apart just from being around for long enough and not kind of being built up perpetually. Now, if a Gone complex collapses or cavitates, cavitation is just kind of a bubble popping in on itself. So if this Gone complex collapses, now all of a sudden I have this, we've jailbroke our tuberculosis bacterium. And now we have further infection and then hopefully further Gone complex formation. If we are talking about somebody that has lost this battle with controlling tuberculosis, we have miliary tuberculosis occurring. Miliary is disseminated. It is so far gone that we cannot control this tuberculosis anymore. You can kind of view this as almost metastatic spread of cancer, right? So it is going through the bloodstream. It's going everywhere in the body. TB is an incredibly common condition. It kills over 1 million people every year. Those cases generally are not located in the U.S. And generally not located in kind of Western Europe, so this is not as big of a point of contention for most people. This is much more of an issue in sub-Saharan Africa than the other places, though. And in these locations, oftentimes we're kind of trying to wipe out this tuberculosis because our immune system has a hard time fighting it. One of the only tools that we have in our quiver are using antibiotics, which the more antibiotics we use, the more rapid we produce antibiotic-resistant versions of these bacterium, and we end up with kind of these really, really resistant strains of bacteria, strains of tuberculosis. An example of what's happening as we start to actually have these gone complexes collapsing is something called Pott's disease. And Pott's disease is occurring when you have tuberculosis in the lungs, and then now it's able to spread out locally. So maybe it's not necessarily jumped into the bloodstream yet, but now this tuberculosis is starting to actually move out into spine or rib tissue. And it's starting to eat and destroy this bone, leading to spinal abnormalities. Pott's disease is a subset of people with tuberculosis will develop POTS. You can kind of think about this as the latent TB is trying to get out of these gone complexes. It's trying to infect the lungs over and over and over again. And eventually, if it breaks out of these gone complexes, it can then move into other tissues that are less able to control and restrict the ability for TB to spread. We care about tuberculosis, and we care about how much tuberculosis is being treated because now we're seeing things like multi-drug resistant. So all of the antibiotics that we would normally use are not effective. We have to reuse really, really powerful antibiotics that might potentially cause us harm, or things like extreme drug-resistant tuberculosis, where literally nothing we can throw at it will work, right? So this is why TB infections are a big problem. Most of the reason why that kind of chart about where TB is in the world has to do with a lot of sub-Saharan Africa, has to do with HIV infections. Remember, a gone complex will hold as long as that person is fairly immunocompetent. If you have an HIV infection, though, well, now you're starting to become immunosuppressed. So if you have HIV, you're more likely to spread tuberculosis to other people. It's going to be able to more likely to jump through your breath as you're breathing out through droplet transmission. This is actually a hospital in Addis Ababa that I've actually been to, weirdly enough, when I was finding pictures for tuberculosis in sub-Saharan Africa. So that was kind of weird and odd to find a series of pictures from the hospital that I've been to in another random country. The last thing that I'm going to talk about is I'm going to talk about a pneumothorax. Pneumothoraxes are just another word for a collapsed lung. Remember, when we're talking about the lungs and really any of our organs, they're wrapped in two layers of this pleural cavity tissue, right? This pleura is a very thin and fluid-producing membrane that is attached directly to either the line of the inside of our ribs, in this case with the pneumothorax, or directly attached to the lungs. This is important because this pleural cavity is filled with a little bit of fluid, and as this little bit of fluid, if I am tugging on my parietal pleura, because this parietal pleura is attached to this diaphragm muscle that is expanding, well, that fluid is non-compressible, so that fluid pulls on that visceral pleura as well, and what I end up getting is I get my lungs being pulled and expanded, right? The fact that this is a closed chamber means that this is going to just kind of suck the lungs open. The problem with this system is if we have some kind of puncture. If air is able to leak into this pleural cavity, air is fairly compressible. So if I'm kind of trying to draw down on this parietal version of the pleura, it's not necessarily really going to pull that lung tissue anymore, and that lung tissue is going to shrink up, right? It's going to collapse. Trauma is a big cause of pneumothorax, especially in kind of non-smoking patients. If we have a patient that is a smoker and they develop a pneumothorax, our first indication is that probably the lung has at least been weakened by things like COPD, this emphysema. This is the problem coming from, is the leak of where this air coming into. Trauma is going to be more likely for this air to be leaking into from the outside of the chest in, or COPD is going to be the air is actually leaking out of these alveoli. If these kind of large, kind of multi-node nodular alveoli, if they're leaking air, that you're breathing this air in, and then some of that is moving into the pleural cavity, you're going to develop a pneumothorax. This is going to kind of hurt, but a lot of times patients don't really know that they have a pneumothorax unless they're kind of putting their lungs under extreme pressure. They might feel like they are breathless or kind of hard to breathe, again with varying degrees of severity. Most of the time, there's not any kind of intervention that we're going to do for an individual with pneumothorax. We're not really going to go in and do surgery or something like that to try and deal with this. Most of the time, unless it's both lungs that are actually deflated, the other lung can deal with this issue for at least a relatively short period of time until whatever hole is causing that air to leak in will get fixed on its own. Right? So we don't particularly intervene too often in pneumothoraxes. One that is a little bit different is something called a tension pneumothorax. And a tension pneumothorax is, we don't just have a hole. We don't just have like a big giant gaping wound inside the lungs. But what is instead happened is we actually have a gasket where, if you almost think about this as the inside of my ribs, if I breathe in, well, the pressure goes down inside that chamber, so the gasket opens, and then as I start to breathe out, the gasket closes, and that air can't escape. So every time someone with a pneumothorax is breathing, more air is going to rush in. Every breath they take, sounds like a Sting song. You guys don't know who Sting is. You're too young. Every time you take a breath in, right, that air is going to rush in, but as that air is rushing, as you're breathing out, that flange is going to close. And that flange means that more and more and more and more air gets trapped inside this pleural cavity. It's not just a collapsed lung, it's a lung that's actively starting to hyperinflate, right? Well, not the lung, but the pleural sac is starting to inflate. And it can actually start to impair heart function, right? Squeezing the heart, squeezing the lungs themselves, and actually even impacting the other lung that is not normally affected, right? So tension pneumothoraxes are a special case of pneumothoraxes that are really bad, right? This is just an example of what that sees, right? You breathe in, air rushes into the pleural cavity. You breathe out, and that gasket slams shut, and that air's trapped there. A question I have is on tension pneumothoraxes. They're going to impair cardiac function mostly by, and this is when you would hit pause, think about it for a second, come back. Tension pneumothoraxes are mostly going to impair cardiac function by preload, right? As I'm squeezing the heart, now those ventricles are under increased pressure, almost like we're talking like cardiac tamponade, where that heart tissue is not able to expand enough, and there's not that much blood leading into that ventricle chamber. We could have something like regurgitation occurring more often, right? If you're squeezing and pushing the heart over because of a pneumothorax on the left side, you could be talking about like causing those valves to not be able to regulate and correctly close and open. So you could have a little bit of regurgitation, but really we're mostly talking about preload issues here, right? Preload is our big problem. And then that's it for the pulmonary system. So